Who knows what Jay-Z, J.K. Rowling, Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey all have in common? Okay, I will tell you then. They have all overcome failure in one shape or form to go on to gain success in their respective careers. Welcome to My Perfect Failure. Join us as we delve into the world of our perfect failures. We will interview, explore, and discuss how our perfect failures can lead us to success. Join us and tune in.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of My Perfect Failure. Today, I'm super excited because I have another amazing guest for you. So, my guest today is a renowned thought leader and systems change expert who has spent the past 35 plus years helping organizations transform conflict into a constructive force for change. In her new book, Remaking the Space Between Us, How Citizens Can Work Together to Build a Better Future for All, she brings her unique expertise to our current social and political rift. She offers tools and insights to help people better relate to those on the opposite side of their political spectrum and to work together to find solutions to our most pressing challenges. So a very warm welcome to My Perfect Failure, Diana Mclain Smith. How are you, Diana?
I'm well, and thank you so much for having me. I love the name of your podcast.
Thank you. Yes, it's one of those things that when I decided I wanted to do a podcast about failure, I don't know whether you ever have this. I know you're an author, so maybe you can relate to this. You have an idea, and then you think, actually, I've got to have a title. I need a title. And then you kind of want to get going with it, really. I got to a point where I wanted to get going with it. And I had about 2 or 3 titles that I was kind of like a little bit lukewarm with, but I thought, you know what, I just want to get going. I just need to get going. And then I was going to, at the time I was working in central London, and I was in a WeWork, and I was going to a meeting. And all of a sudden, this title came to me, My Perfect Failure. And I thought, that's it. That's what That's it. And it just came to me in that moment. And I had to make sure before I went to the meeting that I wrote it down so I didn't forget it. And yeah, so I like the paradox between perfect and failure.
Well, I love the paradox too. And that's exactly the same process by which I came up with the title of my book.
Really?
In fact, the title hit me first and then the book.
That's great because does that almost give you like a sat nav? Maybe you had the idea anyway.
Yes, I've been struggling with these ideas for a long time, but I was thinking more and more about our country and what was going on and thinking about it in light of my experiences historically. And I said, it's the space between us. We have to remake the space between us. And then I went, wow, that's it. So same exact thing. You just get this insight and you know when you have it.
And it's interesting when you get that moment where you just know that makes sense. It's a little spark.
Yes, exactly.
Where we get that exhilaration.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That works.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to have this conversation with you. We had a little chat a second ago, and I love the paradox and what you're doing with your book around remaking the space between us. Before we get into that, what I was keen to maybe do is to get to know you a little bit better.
Sure.
So I read some stuff around you, not everything, but I read some background information around you, and I noticed that when you started working, I think some of the information I read, you were working in communities where there was challenged communities, and you had I guess a white community and a black community.
Yes.
Is that where you kind of had that, I guess, instinct or became more aware of different communities and different conflicts, different challenges? That's
a great question. Yeah.
Where did you get into that space and around conflict? Because I know that you've been helping businesses and organizations with conflicts pretty much ever since.
Well, I used to say I was the Goldilocks of the systems change perspective, because I began working as a community organizer and a political activist. And then I worked with individuals and families, and then I worked with organizations. So the first was very large, political systems. Then I went very small. The political system felt too large. Individuals and families felt too small. Organizations felt about right. But now I'm back to political systems. I've come around 360, but I began working in 2 neighborhoods in Boston. And even before that, it was the 60s, and I had terrific teachers in high school. And so I actually read a lot of Black literature, which is unusual for many white folk of my, in that era.
Yeah.
But I was exposed to James Baldwin and Langston Hughes and Richard Wright. And, it just was like so phenomenally eye-opening. And I got involved in the civil rights movement and in the anti-war movement. And so when I was probably 19, I started working as a community organizer in a predominantly Black community. And I worked for an organization which was predominantly people of color. I was the only white person there. And that was an extraordinary experience. I wasn't well received for understandable reasons. It was a unbelievable experience working with kids and trying to help kids see that they had more. In those days, unlike today, there was a lot of self-help, self-empowerment.
Yeah.
Don't look to other people, look to yourselves to organize your own communities, which I always thought was a terrific and very productive orientation. And that's what I've taken to the book. Very empowering, very liberating. So that's where I began. And then when I was working with kids and their families, I went to the other side of Boston to a neighborhood called Hyde Park, which at the time was predominantly white. It is no longer predominantly white. It was 1974, and it was in the middle of busing. And the white
what's
community.
busing?
Oh, busing. Oh, for people who don't know busing, this was the very well-intended and failed effort for integration by busing poor white kids to poor Black schools, poor Black kids to poor white schools.
Okay.
But the schools were poor.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
an enormous amount of resistance because it was being imposed on people who had very little power. And of course, they reacted to it. And there's blatant racism in Boston and always has been. And so it was like being in the South. I mean, it was no different than integration in the South in the 50s. And so I was working with white kids who were on the other side of the boundary. And so this was the space between us. They had, as W.E.B. Du Bois said 100 years ago, here you had people with identical interests competing and fighting each other.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that was my first exposure to that. And it stayed with me for the rest of my life.
Yeah, because when I read that, I wonder if that was the hook. I wonder if that's what gave you the impetus to actually want to help people and really get people to understand that conflict doesn't need to exist. You strike me as somebody that, because conflict is a very difficult, because it almost feels that sometimes when we have conflict, there's a battle of egos, and really what's right or wrong goes out the window. It's about ego. I want to be, I want my position to be the one that's heard. And what I love about what you do, you strike me as somebody that's very empathetic, passionate, thoughtful, because to want to work in a space where you're having to get people with quite polarized opinions, maybe they're not even well thought out opinions, they're just polarized, they just don't want to position themselves with the opposite, whoever the opposite is, because it's quite a challenging space. What drives you? Is it the lack of clarity that people have around the conflict? Is that what drives you to want to get people to understand that they can actually listen and live in maybe harmony?
Well, harmony is probably more boring than we think it is. And I don't mind conflict. My husband is a negotiator, and he's always seeking to reach agreement. He wrote the book, Getting to Yes. He likes to say that he always tried to avoid conflict and dampen it down, whereas I embrace it as a constructive force for change. because oftentimes when we're conflicting with somebody, we have a conflict with somebody, it can be what you're calling a battle of egos, in the sense that I think we're all raised in a society that has taught us to, it's good to win and not lose. We have this sort of adversarial mindset when it comes to debating. But there's an emergent perspective, which is that you don't have to it's not zero sum. You don't have to win or lose. You can actually start to understand people's different interests, their different concerns, their different hopes, their different worries, their different perspectives. And you can start to get creative about options or solutions that might work for everyone or for most everyone. Now, we live in a society, and this is how I start the book, where there is a percentage of people, but it's a minority, who are locked into their position and don't want to move and won't move. But that group, which is the more extreme left and extreme right, especially the extreme right, which is dominating so much of the world right now, it's the people who are not in that position, who are more in the middle, what's called the exhausted majority. They are letting those people dominate the discourse. Okay. And we've got to stop letting them dominate the discourse, because the people who are in that 70% are much more pragmatic, much more flexible, much more creative, want to find solutions. But the media is riveted on the extremists because they have to sell papers. And so they lead with what bleeds. So they love to make bad things come of conflict, but it is possible to make good things come of conflict.
Okay, that's interesting. So the media potentially, because of their fixation on conflict, on negative
conflict.
Yeah, on
exactly.
negative conflict.
Correct.
That really does everybody a disservice, because to your point, the 70% majority who may be quite considered around other people's opinions and different people's positions, we have well, when we say have no voice, we're not listened to, we're not really spoken about, not given a platform. So I guess that when we're just fed conflict, that's what we, I guess, think that the world is about conflict.
Yes, and I start the book with some research from More in Common, where they did a study of the different, by the way, they've done these studies in Britain as well, but I don't know the results of those studies. But in the US, they discovered that 67% of people are much more flexible, much more pragmatic, and that those people who read the news a lot, consume it a lot, are 3 times more likely to distort the other side than those people who read the news infrequently. So the more news you read, the less informed and the more distorted you are. And they discovered that people who are in the Democratic Party believe people in the Republican Party are more extreme by twice as much, and people in the Republican Party think people in the Democratic Party are more extreme by twice as much as actually exists. So the filter that the media takes to conflict is one that is designed to, I mean, Roger Ailes put it best when he was with Judy Woodruff in an interview in the 1980s. And he was talking about the role of the media. And he goes, it's this simple. He said, you have 2 candidates on the stage. One has a plan for peace in the Middle East. The other falls in the orchestra pit. Who do you think the media is going to cover? Okay. So it's very difficult for people to get a good read on what the reality of the situation really is. Now, I want to say one thing and then throw it back to you. And that is, there's a movement afoot, a very promising movement afoot, to reinvent the news. And one of the essays in my book is Reinventing the News That's Fit to Print. And it talks about this new movement. And there are not only new journalists and approaches to journalism. There's an organization by the name of Solution Journalism Network. And they study not only problems, but the solutions communities are creating to those problems, jointly creating, okay? And then there are platforms like Substack, which allow writers to develop relationships directly with readers, and you get rid of the middleman that is incented by their business model to cover conflict in a negative way. Okay, so we have choices as consumers as to where we're going to get our news, and whether we're going to get news that's going to inflame us or whether we're going to get news that's going to inform and engage us.
That's an interesting perspective and a refreshing perspective. I use Substacks, I'm aware of it, and I do like the independent thoughts and commentary that you get on that particular platform. So in relation to people that we talked about the newspapers and about how they almost have an agenda. I don't know whether it's an agenda to sell papers, because if they can position conflict and actually report conflict, clearly they probably think it's good for headlines and it's going to help them sell papers and create a narrative. And it's almost, in terms of people that maybe form that 70% that actually aren't really on either side in a really firm way, how do we get that 70% or whatever that percent is to get them out of sleepwalking into believing that we have to live in a society where it is polarized? I don't know how we wake ourselves up. Obviously, your book probably goes into that, but it's almost getting us to actually realize that we don't have to live in a society which is ridden by conflict.
Yeah, and again, I don't think conflict will ever go away, but our ability to handle it constructively and creatively, I think, can be widely and wildly improved. There are several ways I come at that in the book that I think are worth mentioning, but the one that I think is probably the one your listeners will find most optimistic is when I started thinking about what lies at the root of polarization, and I came up with this idea that it's the space between us. We've become far more insular within our own groups, demographic and ideological. So it's not just ideology. Demographically, we're quite segregated as a country, okay? And those two are not unrelated, the demographics and the ideology, but they're separate, okay? So we live in very insular groups, very closed-minded, similar, like-minded people. And the more insular we become within our own groups, the more distant we become with people who are different from us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's underneath our polarization. One of the things that I think is very optimistic is that when I started thinking about, well, how do we solve that problem? Because that's a problem, by the way, you and I can solve. Okay. So how do we solve that? I discovered, first I thought it was just thousands. Then I discovered it's tens of thousands. Now I've discovered it's hundreds of thousands and millions of people across the United States in different organizations, thousands of organizations working to open what I call the mental space within groups, so people become more open-minded, and to close the distance across groups that have been historically distant from one another, whether it's racially or in terms of generations or in terms of ideology, okay? There are literally hundreds of thousands of organizations. So I'm just going to give you an example of a couple right now, just because I think your viewers might be interested in this. One is called Starts With Us, and it's a website, and you go on it, and you can see you can take what's called the polarization challenge. And it will send you every day an exercise for you to take to begin to look at your own biases, your own beliefs, your own ways of operating, and so that you can begin to see that you're part of the problem, not just the other side. You yourself are part of the problem, which we've got to recognize. And then that's just one organization. Another one is called Listen First, and the Listen First Project. And they are a coalition of hundreds of organizations that are working to build bridges across divides in the US. And then there's an organization called Not in Our Town, which works very hard to make sure that conflict doesn't turn to hate and hate doesn't turn to violence. There are a million of these organizations, and I write about a whole bunch of them in the book, so they're worth looking at. But there's another way to look at this, which is, and I think this is worth thinking about. So can I just add one more thing before I toss it back to you?
Absolutely.
Okay. So as I was thinking about the space between us, I was thinking about, where does this come from? I mean, first of all, it's existed in our country from our founding. We've always lived our lives in separate groups in this country from the time we were founded. So where did that come from? And I came across a fellow by the name of Thomas Sella, who's an anthropologist. And he studied the evolution of early man. And he said, when we started out millennia ago, we'd go out and we'd try to get the saber-toothed tiger or whoever we were going out to kill. And it was dangerous on your own. So he learned to collaborate with one or two other people. That was the first step we took. We collaborated with one or two other people. But then things became even more competitive and more complex as evolution went forward, just as it is now. And they decided what they needed to do was they needed to hunt in groups. And so they created groups. And they started to create group structures and group norms and group identities, okay? And that started many millennia ago. Now, what people don't often focus on is that the reason people learned to cooperate within groups was so they could compete better against groups. So cooperation and competition evolved hand in hand. And so now fast forward a few millennia and you get to Europe in the 1700s, and that evolutionary vestige or heritage is still with us. We have our own groups and we compete against other groups, whether nation states or the community next door. And so we start to develop ideologies to justify that evolutionary reality. And so we come up with hierarchies, racial hierarchies. We come up with, we have to win. We come up with man is a natural state and you have to compete. None of that is true. It's just a vestige of our evolutionary heritage. But it was absolutely necessary in order to survive early on, okay? Early on, cooperation within groups was absolutely pivotal to survival. Today, all the problems we face cross boundaries, climate change, immigration, migration, war, all of it crosses boundaries. So today, our survival depends on taking another evolutionary step from cooperating within groups to learning to cooperate across groups. And this is the first time we've had the motivation for survival's sake to learn to cooperate across groups. So I'm actually optimistic that if time doesn't run out in terms of climate change, we stand a chance as a species to learn to take another evolutionary step and to learn how to cooperate across groups.
Yeah. Okay. That is encouraging. There's almost, we can, even from a selfish perspective, if we want
it's
to.
It's selfish.
Yeah.
Survive.
Yeah. So we should use the fact that we want to be selfish to collaborate, to see other people's perspective, to be more open, actually.
Yes. Yeah.
And actually live outside of, it just has to be my perspective. It has to be
in my bubble.
Yeah, my bubble. There's something that I saw, I think this was on your website. I think I saw it somewhere when I was researching that, something I wasn't aware of, that there was an initiative. I think this may have been after January 6th, where there was a Congress collaboration between 3 members of the Republican Party and 3 members of the Democrat Party to work together in a more of a cohesive, unified way. That I totally wasn't aware of. That sounds to me very optimistic. Before we hit the record button, we were talking about the House of Commons in the UK, which on a Wednesday where we do PM questions is incredibly chaotic, and I'm not sure they get anything done. But that bipartisan collaborative entity, does that still exist?
Yes, I mean it wasn't just 3 Democrats, Republicans. It was a committee that was formed 2 years before January 6th. It was called the Committee for the Modernization of Congress. And it was trying to find ways to improve the functioning of Congress. And so they got 12 members together. I think it was 12.
Okay, 12.
12 members together, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans. I could be off. It might have been more, but I think it was at least 12. And the person who headed the committee, Derek Kilmer, his first vice chair, this was for the first 2 years, was Representative Timmons from Georgia. I think he's from Georgia. They decided that if they wanted to reform Congress, they were going to have to operate differently themselves. So just like you have your norms in the House of Commons, in Congress, it's very typical for the Republicans to be on one side of a table and Democrats to be on the other. And so they said, we're not going to do that. We're going to get a table where it's Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. We're going to relax the constraints on time. They had a retreat over dinner and an evening of discussion before they even began their work, trying to talk about what their objectives were. They ended up becoming great friends, and they got more done than any committee before them trying to reform Congress. And then January 6th hit. And after January 6th, they had their next round of the committee because it was passed. The Congress said they wanted it to continue its work, so it was going to meet for another 2 years. But that had been so disruptive of the dynamics that were already in bad shape that they decided they had to do another retreat. And this time they actually talked about how they felt about January 6th, and they connected with each other, and they talked about their experience, and they were able to get down to work again. And at the end, they had 200 recommendations that were almost all of them implemented for how they could change the operation of Congress. It was an extraordinary feat. Now, it was a temporary committee, so it then got folded into a standing committee. So that committee no longer is operating, but it's gotten folded into a standing committee.
And the standing committee, how impactful is that? Still, are they still meeting regularly, or
I'm
what's the
sure they
current-
meet regularly, but
Yeah.
I don't know what the latest is on that. It got folded into it's an administrative part of Congress,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure exactly what the status is now. I'm sure it's more difficult now than it was then, but far more productive than you think it is because of your line of sight being the media.
Yeah.
I mean, had you heard of, there's been, I think, 2 articles written on this committee
No,
in all its history.
I was not aware of this
Yeah.
at all before. And when I think about the political state now in the UK, we've just had an election,
I know.
and I know that US has an election this year.
Yes,
France is in all kinds of problems with their current state.
exactly.
So that's why I was very keen to have this conversation with you, because was very encouraged to think that there are people out there that actually are looking at different ways that we can communicate and actually get on better, collaborate. So something that I listened to some of your content where you talk about the need for social movement, social impact, and I think you've kind of alluded to it already when you talk about different groups can think about how we can work together. We can actually think about how we can collaborate. Is that really vital in order for us to bridge the gap, and to the title of this book, Remaking the Space Between Us, kind of narrowing that?
Well, I don't see how we can move forward as a country or a political system or a culture if we don't start to break out of our own insulated groups, and start reaching across the various divides, whether they are ideological or demographic. I don't see how you do it, because anytime one group comes up with a solution, another group will just block it.
Yeah.
So if we want to, I mean, it's just a reality now. It's true of Britain too. We are a multi-group democracy. There isn't a ruling class anymore. Okay, it's a multi-group. This isn't a moral statement. It's just true. We're a multi-group system. And anytime you systematically leave out one or more groups, they're going to block you. And when they block you, they stop progress. Well, we don't really have a lot of time for people to be blocking progress on the kinds of problems we have right now. Our survival depends on us beginning to come up with solutions that multiple groups can live with.
Yeah.
Or else we're not going to have any solution at all. And if we have no solution at all, well, Mother Nature is going to trump us. No pun intended.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about, because everybody can, I was thinking, do we leave it to politicians to set the example, or is it really about us all as individuals who might be part of different communities or different groups? Is this kind of like a rallying call just for all of us to think about, people should get your book. We'll leave a link on the website, but it doesn't matter, because sometimes when we think about challenges, we think about how can I impact the current status
Sure,
quo? So
sure.
we position it as this gigantic situation or gigantic, I guess, situation that we possibly, how can Paul impact this? So is it really about us all thinking about actually we can impact it? Because
We can. There's no question.
it's almost like a pincer movement. You've got groups here, groups there, and then all of a sudden momentum is built.
Um, First of all, I think it would be great if we had an Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King emerge and become the model. Okay. It would be great. But we are in a political environment right now, which we have created as people, where they're not coming. They can't get elected, not in our political system. Now, people rightfully say we've got to reform our political system so that extremists don't dominate it. We have a primary system and a winner-takes-all system in the US that makes it very difficult to elect people who might be terrific leaders. There's no question that's true. But the only way you're going to reform that political system is if people like you and me call for it, which is not happening because the extremists are dominating the political reality. And the rest of us are ceding our control and ceding our power. And this book is calling on us not to cede our power. And literally thousands of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands are already doing it. You don't have to take this on as an individual. There are communities working on local problems that are nationally connected, where you can find other people like you who care about the problems in your community and are working on them across these divides with people. I mean, look at the website, look at my book, go to Starts With Us, go to Listen First. These organizations are out there just waiting for people who are feeling helpless to get empowered. Now, I just want to also mention one other thing, because I understand how powerless people feel. I really do. And I understand people are waiting for the system to change before they feel like they can change. But I want to just mention a few things, okay? This is the first one, examples of citizens leading nations out of darkness, not political leaders, but citizens, okay? In World War II, when British soldiers and French soldiers and Belgian soldiers were stuck on the shores of Dunkirk, okay? 300,000 soldiers. If they hadn't been rescued, we would have lost World War II. Who saved them? A flotilla of boats and British citizens. That's who saved them, okay? That's a huge accomplishment. India breaking free of British rule. You had Gandhi, but you had hundreds of thousands of citizens with Gandhi fighting for India's independence. The abolitionist movement in the United States ended slavery. The civil rights movement ended segregation and got voting rights passed. The suffrage movement got women's rights. That wasn't a politician who decided to do that. The solidarity movement in Poland brought down the Soviet Union. The military dictatorship in Argentina was brought down by a citizen movement. We ended legal apartheid in South Africa through a citizens movement. We fought to establish a democracy in America through an independence movement. These are all citizen-led movements, all of them. And we need it now.
Yeah. Those are wonderful examples that you can, society glosses over, or maybe we gloss over because we don't think about those. We think we have to live in a world where everything is polarized. So that's
I don't think it's that. I think we don't see our power as citizens. I don't think it has to do with conflict. I think it has to do with we are raised by parents who tell us what to do, and we haven't gotten over it. We keep looking up instead of inside.
Yeah. And do you think that we wait for other people to lead the charge and we just can stand on the sidelines? There was a thing in psychology called bystander apathy, where we just we want other people maybe to take the initiative, and then if we choose to follow, we do, or we don't.
Yeah, I do, but I don't think it's because we're bad people or we're lazy. I think it's because we really have been raised not to think that we have power. I really do. I think, we grow up in a hierarchical system at home, in our church, in our schools, in our workplace, and we've drunk the Kool-Aid. We don't realize the extent to which that hierarchy is a social construction, and it does not need to be accepted by us.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about papers and the media earlier, and they perpetuate the the constructs that potentially exist
Yes.
in terms
Yeah.
of different groups like Republicans or Democrats. In the UK, it's Labour or Conservative. In the other countries, that they will have their own main groups. So in terms of how and we talk about Substack, another platform where is more independent of thought. So do you think that we just need to be more? I'm thinking about younger kids. I'm thinking about children are at college and maybe going to university, and because that's where it starts. And you hope that the generation beyond us
Yeah.
are more aware that they do have power. They do not have to believe everything the media says. They can
Yeah.
be more
Yeah.
considered in thought. Do you think there's an opportunity for the younger generation maybe to be looking at the ideas in remaking the space between us? Because these are the people that will be in the next 10, 20 years being having really significant roles in society and the world.
Definitely think the younger generation has extraordinary potential. And all of us, including the younger generation, need to become aware of the ways in which we've been socialized to believe certain things
Mm,
in common. So, what I mean by that is we may disagree about a policy. We may disagree about what ought to happen in the Middle East. We may disagree about what a candidate is proposing, but the way in which we disagree is identical. We all push our view. We don't ask a lot of questions of the other person. We make assumptions about their motives and their character. We discount their beliefs. We don't inquire into their experiences. We don't seek to learn things that we might be missing. That is how we are socialized. And this goes back to what I said about our evolutionary legacy. If we don't change that, if the younger generation doesn't change that, then we're going to struggle.
What do you think about like university and the educational system? Because you've got thought leaders that educate children, young adults, and you have. I guess I'm thinking around. I guess it's a difficult question to actually ask or quantify. But I'm just thinking about the education system being more in tune with giving a balanced perspective around different ways of thinking, teaching kids to be or young adults to be more compassionate, more empathetic, more open to collaboration, because I think there's a unique opportunity there. I don't know how that would manifest itself, but you think that, if I don't have children, but if I had children, I would want them to be open-minded. I would want
Sure,
them to listen. I would want
sure,
them to not want to force their opinions on other
sure,
people. And some of that clearly stems from how we raise our children. So if I was a parent, I would have to, I would want to raise my children in that way. But I think that when they leave home and they go into the educational system, where there's going to be more, they're going to form more of their identity and their personality. I just wonder whether, I don't know whether we can lay the challenge at institutions' doors, but do you think there's an opportunity there to actually have material like remaking the space between us? I think that's really important, because if I was a lecturer and I had this book, I would want to teach my undergraduates how they can be more empathetic, how that they can
yeah,
So
Yep. Yeah.
I'll let you answer the question. I've
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
gone on a
No,
bit
no,
of a
no.
soapbox.
Yeah, it's making me want to go back and say quickly something about the media, which is it's very easy to talk about the media as a monolith, and same with an educational system. And there is a lot of variation. I want to say that because it can sound like a slam against everybody in the media. And there are some excellent outlets, and just like they're excellent universities and colleges and so on. But I wanted to say there's an organization called Constructive Dialogue Institute. And then there's another one, I'm blocking on it right now. Oh, Braver Angels. And they have partnerships with universities to teach these skills to people so that they can talk across divides. And those are just two, by the way. There are a lot of other ones. So yes, I think the university is a natural context for these ideas to start to get passed down to the next generation. And there are a lot of people who are at work doing just that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's fabulous.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm conscious of your time, so I've got a couple of questions, if
Yeah.
I may. So one is around hope. So you've written this wonderful book, and how did you feel at the end of the process? Were you more hopeful having gone through the process of researching, putting the book together? Did you learn things about that you didn't know, I guess, when you started the process that gives you hope moving forward?
It blew me away. I mean, I started out so depressed. I was so worried. And the first thing I did was try to understand how we got here. And that wasn't a cheery journey. Okay. But then I started looking at what people were doing. And I really, parts 2, 3, and 4 are just stunning in terms of what people are doing. This organization, Not in Our Town, a political alliance in Maine. I mean, it just goes on and on. What people are doing with the press, what people are doing with misinformation, what people are doing on the internet. It is just extraordinary. So I ended up feeling incredibly hopeful in the end. And even as we look down the barrel of a gun, as we enter this November election, okay, I am still I think about the body politic in the US as having an immune system that can fight germs and cancer. And the immune system are these organized groups across the US of citizens who are going to protect us from assaults to our democracy and to our way of life. And there are so many of them out there. I'm hoping more and more people support them in terms of their time and in terms of their money. So I want to read you a quote, if I could.
Yeah, absolutely. Lovely.
From one of the 3 people I'd have at my dinner table.
Okay.
And I'm not going to tell you who said it yet.
Oh,
Okay. I'm
okay.
going to read the quote. It was written in 1964 or so. I may be off by a year. And the quote is, "Well, I am tired. I don't know how it will come about. I know that no matter how it comes about, it will be bloody. It will be hard." And so I feel that now about November. I feel that right now.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the next paragraph is, "I still believe that we can do with this country something that has not been done before. We are misled here because we think of numbers. You don't need numbers. You need passion. And this is proven by the history of the world," which those examples I gave you illustrate, right? So who do you think said that? 1960s.
So I'm going to say, so my brain automatically is telling me Martin Luther King.
James Baldwin.
James Baldwin. Okay, that makes sense.
And James Baldwin was somebody who looked at our reality hard in the face and described some of the worst aspects of our nation, okay, and our history. And he was still able to say, "I still believe we can do with this country something that has not been done before. We are misled because we think of numbers. You don't need numbers, you need passion." That is proven by the history of the world, and that is true.
Yeah.
And so that's where my hope lies.
Yeah. And that's echoed in the examples that you gave earlier, in all the
Yes.
examples you gave earlier.
Yes, exactly.
And what's refreshing around that and exciting is that because I do think at times we fixate on numbers, and sometimes we become not maybe intimidated is not the right word. We may become less active because we think of a big
Or
number, and is it
despairing.
yeah, despairing is
Yeah.
a better word. Yeah,
Yeah,
we despair. We don't think that we can have an impact
exactly.
because of a big number. So I love the idea that James talks about, and you've echoed this, about passion, how important passion is,
Yes.
and how far passion can take us. And I think for anybody that's listening that is in a group that you feel maybe despondent because maybe you feel that it's difficult to maybe to get your point across, they can lean into their passion.
Yes. And the numbers are on our side anyway. 70%.
Yeah.
We just got to get busy recruiting that 70%. And that's what these organizations are doing.
Yeah. And that's an interesting number because I think most of us don't think we're in that 70%. We think that we're in
A tiny number.
yeah, and we don't think that. So it's a different way of thinking as well.
Yeah. It's actually the precise number is 67. So I'm rounding up, but 67 is big too.
Yeah, it's a big number.
Yeah, it's a big number.
It's a big number.
And if we mobilize those people who are more pragmatic and flexible and who want to build a better future, we've got a really good chance of doing it.
Yeah. And actually that's really exciting because when you say that number, I think of opportunity.
Yes.
Good opportunity. Good opportunity to be impactful, to do something great with passion and excitement.
Yep.
Yeah. So for the book, I'm going to put a link in the show notes for everybody to get the book.
That would be great.
Yeah. So no problem. I'm excited. And if people want to contact you or maybe learn more about you, where's the best place for people to find you?
Remakingthespace.org.
Okay.
Diana at remakingthespace.org.
Okay, lovely. So I will put a link in the show notes so people can find
and my
you.
and my website is remakingthespace.org. And then I also have a Substack newsletter.
Okay.
Which I'd highly recommend because I've learned so much more since writing the book. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I keep refreshing what I'm learning. Yeah.
Really? So you've learned even more since writing the book?
Yeah. It's incredible. Oh,
wow.
Yeah. It's incredible.
Wow.
So that's also called Remaking the Space. It's a Substack newsletter called Remaking the Space.
Okay. I'm going to get a link for that and put that in the show notes as well.
That would be great.
So everything we've spoken about, I'm going to get links for those.
Oh, that's terrific.
And put those on the show notes because I've only just met you, but I'm a fan already. I'm a fan.
Oh, well, I'm a fan of your show already too.
I
love the title.
Good. Or maybe, well, not maybe, definitely we should have more conversations and maybe around the November time because I think that's going to be an interesting
Oh my God,
time.
That will be intense.
Yeah,
let's do it after the election so we can pick up the pieces.
Yeah, let's do it after.
Yeah,
Let's have a conversation.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. And maybe we can elaborate on the book a little bit more. Maybe we've got a bit of feedback from everybody that reads the book. And
that would be terrific.
So last question is, if you could invite 3 inspirational people for lunch, we know one of them, who would you invite?
Again, I struggled with this so much. The usual suspects, which I've decided not to include, but I'm going to say their names just because Abraham Lincoln was such an extraordinary leader. He would be on the list, but I'm not going to include him because he's on everybody's list. But there's somebody who probably isn't on everybody's list who I think is very important for people to know about, and that is Václav Havel. That's Vaclav, Václav Havel, Havel. He was a poet, a playwright, and an essayist. And he was also president of Czechoslovakia after the Soviet Union fell apart. And he wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. And you've heard me throughout this conversation with you keep talking about we have the power, we have the power, okay? He wrote an incredible essay during the 1980s, when the solidarity movement in Poland was starting to lose steam, and the essay reached the union floor and it revived the movement, and that movement eventually took down the Soviet Union. And it's a wonderful essay. It's a little bit tough going, but it's The Power of the Powerless. I highly recommend it. He would be someone I would love to have at the table, because he really did understand that we do have the power even when we don't see it. If we organize, if we come together as a collective and organize. So that's one. The other is Maya Angelou, because she had an extraordinary capacity to see into the human heart and to describe her experience in a way that brought people in, did not push them away. And she wrote a book that's very famous, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And it's a wonderful book, and it had a profound impact on me. And it affected not only how I wrote as a writer, but how I was a teacher, and it also affected how I taught. And I had a group of 6 men that I led a seminar with. And when they first entered the seminar, they talked about how it was going to be touchy-feely, and they were it was in a corporation, okay? It was touchy-feely, and, they were joking that they'd call themselves the Brotherhood of Love. This was all behind my back initially, okay? And I heard about the Brotherhood of Love slam. So when we first met, I said, we need a name for our group. And they had no idea what was coming. I said, what about the Brotherhood of Love? And they all looked so sheepish. But anyway, the third week into the seminar, I assigned I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, Maya Angelou's book. And they said, oh my God, this sounds like a chick flick. After they read the book, they were so moved, so profoundly affected by it, that when Maya Angelou came to Boston to give a talk or whatever at the Boston Symphony, a huge, like 1,000 people, they were the ones who organized a trip to go see her reading. Okay.
Wow.
They were so profoundly moved. So this is a woman who could talk across any divide. And she was an extraordinary human being. So I would love to meet her and have her at the dinner table.
She would love your book as well.
I hope so.
Oh, she would. She would love the ideology behind it.
Yeah, I hope so.
So it was James Baldwin one as well.
James Baldwin as well. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And because there's Eddie Glaude, who's an extraordinary writer in his own right, wrote a book about James Baldwin called Begin Again. And the reason he wrote it is he was despairing after the 2016 election. And he was trying to figure out, how did James Baldwin go on when the civil rights movement fell apart? How did James Baldwin begin again? And so his book, Begin Again, was an inquiry into how do we pick up the pieces and keep on going in the face of so much that looks like it's falling apart. And it's a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it.
I've written that down.
Yeah.
I'll probably get that. I'm appreciative of time, so I will let you go. But I think it's very encouraging, James Baldwin as an example, where we think that we are incapacitated and we can't move forward. But I think it's the power of thought, passion, hope.
Yes.
If we fuse these ideologies together, then we all have tremendous capabilities and opportunities. And it's really living within that mindset where we are capable, we are impactful, we can make a difference, and we aren't powerless. Even if we talk about the media a lot, and maybe I shouldn't use that as the ultimate analogy in terms of what perpetuates these,
but it doesn't help.
It doesn't help.
Yeah.
Doesn't help. But what this conversation leaves me with, it does leave me with hope. It does excite me, actually, because when you listen to a narrative, well, I might listen to the news, I might read a paper, I might go on social media, it kind of debilitates you a little bit.
It does. It's soul sucking.
Yeah, and it makes you just exist without actually believing that we can do anything that is impactful.
Exactly.
What this conversation has done, it's actually given me that, yes, I can actually be impactful. I can do something. So thank you.
You're welcome. And I really hope it does it for your listeners. And I hope the book does too.
I'm sure it will. And
Yeah.
I'm excited to hear about listeners, how they get on with it, and also maybe little things that they start to do that maybe they thought was
They couldn't
beyond,
do. Yeah,
was beyond them. So thank you so
exactly.
much, and hopefully we can
Well,
talk
thank you.
after November.
Absolutely. And thank you. This is
Thank,
great. I
thank
love
you,
this conversation.
thank you. Same here, same here.
Okay.
Same here. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this episode of My Perfect Failure. We're always looking to grow the show. So if you are watching on YouTube, please do hit the subscribe button. It really does help us grow the channel. And your feedback is most welcome. So we're keen to hear about the things you like and equally the things you don't like. So you can find me at paul@myperfectfailure.com, or you can find me via the contact page on the website. So take care for now. Bye.
Thanks for listening to My Perfect Failure podcast. Be sure to visit www.myperfectfailure.com to join the conversation. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Google Play. Look out for our next episode.